to the Third Congress of the African People's Socialist Party that was delivered in this city, St. Petersburg, Florida, in 1990. And the political report is something that is prepared by me for every Congress of the African People's Socialist Party. It functions sort of as the main resolution. And it is my responsibility to put this political report in the hands of everybody in the party, every member of the African People's Socialist Party from 3 to 4 months prior to the Congress. It gives everybody an opportunity to study the political report and to be able to work on reports and things that they're preparing for the Congress, and to be able to criticize, to critique, and capable of speaking on the report at the Congress, whether supported or not. Because this political report is something that has to be adopted by the entire membership of the African People's Socialist Party. It has to be something that the membership is capable of saying it represents how we understand the situation in the entire world, how we understand the location of the struggle of African people in the world at this moment, how we understand the task that we've established for ourselves, for the party at this time. It is also a part of the process of democratic centralism that requires all the leaders of the party to provide reports to the constituent or to the organizations, committees, and what have you that we lead. And as the leader of the party, I have this responsibility. This is a really important political report. It was groundbreaking in many ways, in that what we did here is began to elaborate on many of the ideological, theoretical questions that not only confront our struggle as African people, but we are convinced, and I am convinced, confronts the majority of people in the world who engaged in trying to understand, trying to interpret, and trying the world, and trying to move forward to change our circumstances. This particular chapter 4, A New Page in World History, it's relatively short, but what it does is it does make an assault on some of the understandings of political economy and history that had been guiding struggles, even our own struggle, for a long period of time. And now I'm going to use, you're going to be confronted, some of you, with terminology that you may not be that familiar with, and concepts that you may not be that familiar with, and even language. So we expect to have an opportunity to discuss some of these ideas. Like I said, it's a short chapter. I think it's only about 9 pages long, something like that. I'm going to read through it, and as I move forward, I may stop and elaborate on some points here, but I should be able to go through it quickly enough so that there'll be ample time for you to raise questions. The thing is that I'm hoping that nobody in this meeting will be reluctant to raise questions or to make interventions based on an assumption that somehow to do so will expose ignorance. Because sometimes, you know, we don't want to open our mouths because we assume that we'll be letting somebody else know what we don't know. But truthfully, I do believe that it's quite possible that some of the language and concepts that we'll be dealing with will be foreign to many of the people, some of the people on this call, not necessarily many, because many of the people have been involved in these studies now for some time. So I'm going to go forward, and we're on chapter 4, in Izwe-Letu Africa. This is the name of the political report, and it was Izwe-Letu Africa, and it is translatable as Africa is our land. So, A New Page in World History, that's the title of this chapter 4. Today we are experiencing an epoch in which a new page is being turned in world history. It is an epoch which is being mischaracterized as an epoch of failure or crisis of socialism. This mischaracterization is due to the open collaboration between what has until recently been considered the leadership of the international socialist camp, namely China and the Soviet Union and the US, and the disintegration of the so-called Soviet bloc. So there were European powers, white powers throughout Europe and the United States who actually had great celebrations. They thought they were dancing on the grave of socialism. Socialism is dead. The Soviet Union had capitulated. The Soviet Union, which was supposed to be the center of the entire socialist movement, or almost the entire socialist movement, because China was also supposed to have been the really socialist power, and there was contention between the Soviet Union and China. So when we saw the capitulation of the Soviet Union, the disappearance of the Soviet Union, doesn't even exist anymore. There's now Russia and various other entities that were part of what was supposed to be the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union comes from the term after the success of the 1917 Russian Revolution. There were different other surrounding entities and countries that became a part of this. And the Soviet Union comes from the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And so people simply referred it to as the Soviet Union, referred to it as the Soviet Union, and sometimes they refer to themselves as the Soviet Union. So, and when the Soviet Union collapsed, fell apart, and then China, of course, was going in an entirely different kind of direction, but particularly the Soviet Union, the imperialist countries assumed they were dancing on the grave of socialism. They really celebrated this. But we say they were wrong. While imperialist ideologues and some called leftists have been rejoicing, and many other leftists have been demoralized and confused by this so-called crisis of socialism, we African internationalists in the African People's Socialist Party have understood that what is being characterized as a crisis of socialism is instead a crisis of imperialism. Instead of confusion, demoralization, or collaboration with this parasitic system, we are experiencing a new determination to defeat imperialism, based on the ever-increasing validation of our theory. So we're saying that every passing day validates how we've understood the world. We never have understood the world the way most of the Marxists and people who call themselves communists and socialists understood how history was moving. And so we were not demoralized by what happened in the Soviet Union or in China. And we'll see why as we move forward. We have always said that those who saw the fundamental struggle in the world as existing between the minority white workers and bosses of the world were mistaken. We have always said that the essential class struggle in the world does not exist between the white workers and the white ruling class, but is actually concentrated in the struggle against colonialism and economic dependency. Indeed, whether he knew it or not, Karl Marx inferred as much himself when in part 8 of Capital he wrote, quote, "In fact, the veiled slavery of the wage workers in Europe needed for its pedestal slavery pure and simple in the New World." This statement by Marx is simply another way of saying that capitalism, the entire basis and superstructure of white power as it exists, has its origin in and rests upon a pedestal of African oppression. So the entire capitalist system was resting on this oppression of African people. This is what Marx infers when he says that the veiled slavery of the wage workers in Europe needed for its pedestal slavery pure and simple in the New World. And when they talk about the veiled slavery, often people refer to capitalism and wage workers, people who work for wages, somehow participating in this wage slavery. And wage slavery, of course, is to be distinguished from the kind of slavery that we were experiencing as a people, where we got no resources and just work like beasts and what have you. So, and it's really interesting that he would call it even a veiled slavery, a wage slavery, because in other words, you're slaves as if you get paid. And the very definition of slavery is the fact that you don't get paid, right? And so, but they're saying that the capitalism and all of its activity required as a pedestal slavery pure and simple. This is the foundation upon which the entire capitalist process functions. This statement, okay, and so other statements in this same work by Karl Marx make this point abundantly clear. Quote, this is Marx. We have seen how money, this is a really important statement. We have seen how money is changed into capital, how through capital surplus value is made, and from surplus value, more capital. But the accumulation of capital presupposes surplus value. Surplus value presupposes capitalist production. Capitalistic production presupposes the pre-existence of considerable masses of capital and labor power in the hands of producers of commodities. This whole movement, therefore, seems to turn in a vicious circle, out of which we can only get by supposing a primitive accumulation, the previous accumulation of Adam Smith, preceding capitalistic accumulation, an accumulation not the result of the capitalist mode of production, but a starting point. So he's saying that all of this activity requires an accumulation of capital. Capitalism itself needed capitalist accumulation, capitalist production. But how the hell do we get capitalist production when you don't, unless you have capitalist accumulation? So where does the capitalist accumulation come from? And he says that in order to get out of this vicious circle, we have to presuppose that there was an accumulation of capital that was not a consequence of capitalist production, but a starting point. It started with this accumulation of capital that was not responding to capitalist production, because capitalism didn't exist. Do you see what we're saying? So how does this thing start? He said we have to assume that there was an accumulation of capital that did not come from capitalist production, but started the entire thing. This, again quoting Marx, this primitive accumulation plays in political economy about the same part as original sin in theology. That's heavy. Because original sin in theology establishes the basis for all sin that happens thereafter. Accumulation functions in the same way in political economy as original sin does in theology, is that every bad thing, every aspect of capitalism has its origin right here. And let's talk about primitive accumulation. So he says that he goes back to original sin in theology. I'm reading, Adam bit the apple, and thereupon sin fell on the human race. Its origin is supposed to be explained when it is told as an anecdote of the past. In times long gone by, there were two sorts of people. One, the diligent, intelligent, and above all frugal elite. The other, lazy rascals, spending their substance and more in riotous living. The legend of theological original sin tells us certainly how man came to be condemned to eat his bread in the sweat of his brow. But the history of economic original sin reveals to us that there are people to whom this is by no means essential. Never mind. Thus it came to pass that the former sort accumulated wealth, and the latter sort had at last nothing to sell except their own skins. The former sort the sort that was frugal, that was intelligent, and the rest of it, and worked very hard. And from this original sin dates the poverty of the great majority that, despite all its labor, has up to now nothing to sell but itself, and wealth, and the wealth of the few that increases constantly, although they have long ceased to work. Such insipid childishness is every day preached to us in defense of property. We got that? Okay. Is that complex? We'll talk more if we have to. So you should make notes. If another place in part 8 of Capital, Marx further explains what this primitive accumulation is that preceded capitalist accumulation, but that was not the result of the capitalist mode of production, but a starting point. Quote, this is Marx: the discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement, and entombment in mines of the aboriginal population, the beginning of the conquest and looting of the East Indies, the turning of Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of black skins, signalized the rosy dawn of the era of capitalist production. This is where it started. These idyllic proceedings are the chief momenta of primitive accumulation. This is where it comes from. On their heels treads the commercial wars of the European nations with the globe for theater. It begins with the revolt of the Netherlands from Spain, assumes great dimensions in England's anti-Jacobin war, and is still going on in the opium wars against China, unquote. So Marx's Capital was written in 1867, but 20 years previously, in 1847, Marx had made the same point about the primitive accumulation that was the origin of capitalist production as it actually occurred in the world. In a work called The Poverty of Philosophy, Marx reveals the historical significance of Africa in the emergence of capitalism, not only for the accumulation of pre-capitalist capital, but also for the origin of the capitalist world economy, the existence of which was also preconditioned for the rise of capitalism. So we mentioned pre-capitalist capitalism, and we're talking about this accumulation of capital that happened before there was capitalist production. That's what we're referring to, this pre-capitalist capitalism. So here's what Marx says. This is another quote, and this comes from The Poverty of Philosophy. Quote, direct slavery is as much the pivot of bourgeois industry as machinery, credits, etc. Without slavery, you have no cotton. Without cotton, you have no modern industry. It is slavery that gave the colonies their value. It is the colonies that created world trade. And it is world trade that is the precondition of large-scale industry. Thus, slavery is an economic category of the greatest importance. That's what you've become by, an economic category. Okay. Without slavery, North America, the most progressive of countries, this is 1847 he's writing this. Without slavery, North America, the most progressive of countries, would be transformed into a patriarchal country. Wipe North America off the map of the world, and you will have anarchy, the complete decay of modern commerce and civilization. Cause slavery to disappear, and you will have wiped America off the map of nations. Unquote. In the last paragraph quoted above, Marx attributes American progressiveness to African slavery. Moreover, Marx also makes the most coherent and cogent argument of what it would take to destroy capitalism or modern commerce, didn't he? Well, he said it. He said, I'm going to read this again. Without slavery, North America, the most progressive of countries, would be transformed into a patriarchal country. Wipe North America off the map of the world, and you will have anarchy, the complete decay of modern commerce and civilization. Cause slavery to disappear, and you will have wiped America off the map of nations. That's the formula for ending capitalism. Okay? So in the last paragraph quoted above, Marx attributes American progressiveness to African slavery. Moreover, Marx also makes the most coherent and cogent argument of what it would take to destroy capitalism or modern commerce. However, Marx was not able to conclude that the struggle to overturn the pedestal, that is to say, that is the foundation of the entire capitalist enterprise, that the veiled slavery of the wage worker in Europe needed was the fundamental revolutionary task for the defeat of capitalism. Let me go back. We say, however, Marx was not able to conclude that the struggle to overturn the pedestal that the veiled slavery of the wage workers in Europe needed was the fundamental revolutionary task for the defeat of capitalism. That's the fundamental task, overturning this pedestal. Do you see that he says all capitalist activity required for its existence? That's the task, not fighting on the pedestal by the white workers to take over the white bourgeoisie. That's why we say the locus of the class struggle is not this contest that happens between the industrial working class and the industrial ruling class or the industrial capitalist class. The locus of the class struggle is between those who constitute the pedestal, that is to say, the colonial and colonized masses of the world, and the bourgeoisie, the colonial bourgeoisie. So we say that this is because Marxist theory requires that the defeat of capitalism occur as a consequence of a contest between white workers and the white ruling class. It has been left to us, African internationalists, whose enslavement constituted the origin of modern commerce, to identify within the struggle in our own self-interest the basis for the defeat of capitalism and the rise of socialism. We have written more about this in the past, not only quoting Marx, but even more extensively, but other theoreticians and historians who have also researched and exposed the origins of capitalism, some more so than Marx. The significance of this research is its usefulness in exposing that the fundamental contradiction, the resolution of which would result in the historically based advent of socialism, has never existed between the industrial white working class and the ruling class. The real locus of class contradiction in the real world exists in the contest between capitalism, born as a world system, and the pedestal upon which it rests. Hence, the 1917 revolution in Russia was not a true socialist revolution, since the real historical basis for socialism, which is the destruction of the pedestal upon which capitalism rests and which is required for its existence, had not occurred. I hope that's understood. Because we say that we are historical materialists. There's a historical basis for the arrival of socialism, the destruction of capitalism. We've just been talking about that. And we're saying, so in 1917, where the first quote unquote socialist revolution was supposed to have occurred in Russia, it wasn't a real socialist revolution because the historical basis for the advent of socialism had not occurred. And the historical basis is the destruction of the pedestal upon which the whole capitalist thing rests. This is why when we saw what happened with the Soviet Union, we weren't shocked. We didn't see this as the defeat of socialism because the historical basis for socialism did not yet exist. The slaves were still enslaved, and this is the pedestal upon which the whole socialist, the whole capitalist edifice rests, okay? We say that what happened in Russia in 1917 was the existence of conditions which constituted the political basis for socialists to seize state power. So we had a situation in Russia in 1917 where the historical basis for the rise of socialism did not exist, but the political conditions that allowed socialists to take power did exist. So socialists actually took power in Russia, but people taking power is not enough to itself. However, the seizure of state power by socialists did not change the reality that the world economy, even the world economy within which Russia existed, was and continues to be a capitalist world economy. It is the same world economy created by the slave trade and augmented by other facets of parasitic or primitive accumulation that transformed the vast majority of the peoples and countries of the world into great reservoirs of human and material resources, largely for European and North American exploitation. Through the capture of state power, socialists in Russia were able to effect some important changes in the lives of the Russian Soviet peoples. Immediately, they were able to put Russia out of the terrible First Imperialist World War. Although the Russian people would suffer imperialist-supported civil war and actual imperialist invasion, which caused immeasurable human suffering and economic damage. But they did pull Russia out of the First War. The Russian Revolution also resulted in the destruction of Tsarism or Russian feudalism. Feudalism still existed in Russia, and this is one of the things that makes Russia interesting also, because what we have is the whole white world moved from feudalism into capitalism. And then and they moved to feudalism to capitalism, from feudalism to capitalism. How? By going to Africa, by looting other countries and things like that. And that's what gave rise to capitalism, okay? But in Russia, feudalism was not destroyed by a movement to capitalism. Feudalism was destroyed by socialists who took power, so they didn't go through this whole process of capitalist accumulation that came from slavery, came from colonial domination of non-white peoples around the world. And what that meant in part was even the character of Russian society was different. Even now it's different, even though it's capitalist society, even though the ideas and stuff that comes from participating in a capitalist society has also penetrated Russian society, is nothing like what we find in the rest of the white world. The Russian thing is different, and it's capitalist. Don't make any mistake about that. I'm not saying that Russia is not capitalist and therefore Russia is not capable of doing the thing that capitalist countries do. But Russia is different because it did not come from this whole process. The economy, Russian capitalism did not come through the process of primitive accumulation, stealing from Africa, Asia, and the rest of the world. Russia went from feudalism to the socialist state, and which made different kinds of assumptions, and even the Soviet Union entered into other kinds of relationship with peoples around the world. Here you got the capitalists whose whole economy is based on strangling Africa, stealing everything from Africa, all these other places. And the Russians come a part of this socialist state that lines up in solidarity with Africans and other places, and in a contest with the other white states. And Russia was under terrible pressure from France and England, United States, and all of this, in part because they've been preaching this philosophy that says that the workers, the people, the working people who are most exploited should be in power. And they have said that the Russian Revolution proves to the world that the workers can run society and can take care of ourselves. Countries that's based on a absolutely, totally different idea about how society is supposed to be run. And the Russian Revolution threatened America, threatened France, threatened England, threatened Germany, threatened all these other places because, hell, here you got the bourgeoisie up there, and then these crackers over here talking about if the workers can take power and actually do it in Russia, they can do it in England. They can do it in America. They can do it. And so these were places that were threatened by the existence of the Soviet Union. Then the Soviet Union is lining up with Africans and other peoples around the world as a part of this overall struggle. So the rest of the white world terrified and did everything they could to undermine. They attacked it from so many different angles and so many different ways throughout the existence of the so-called Soviet Union. But the Russian thing was different. And even today, Russians still have this sentiment that sometimes declare that they're not even Europeans, and sometimes refer to themselves as Euro-Asians, right? Because if you look at what is called Russia, the vast majority of this huge sector of people who live in Asia. And so often they refer to themselves as Euro-Asians, and part of their history would justify that based on, and you got to also understand this, for years and years and years, even before the Russian Revolution, the Russians had a whole sense of how do you call it when people don't have self-confidence in themselves, because they were still living in feudalism, even as the rest of Europe was experiencing capitalist, development and stuff like that. The Russians under the Tsar had this whole feudal existence, and the elite in Russia didn't speak Russian. They spoke French, because French was the language of the educated, the cultured, etc. So the elite, the upper class in Russia, did not speak Russian. They spoke French. And so this whole lack of self-confidence existed even then. In terms of, my point is that they have for a long time experienced this difference, this contradiction with the rest of Europe. In fact, part of what kicked off a Russian Revolution in 1905 was Russia got in a war with Japan, and Japan kicked his ass. And that was just intolerable because, you had these non-white people in an era of white domination of the whole world, and Russia jumped on Japan, and Japan dusted it, So Russia has always had this different kind of relationship, or for a very long time anyway, with the rest of Europe. The Russian Revolution also resulted in the destruction of Tsarism, or Russian feudalism. The great feudal estates of the Russian nobility were seized, and this facilitated the ability of the revolution to address the starvation, oppression, and land deprivation of the peasants. And I'm mentioning this because this made for rapid kind of change for a brief period of time under the leadership of socialists in Russia, that gave the impression of socialist leap that was happening, and that it validated what the Russians were saying about the superiority of socialism over capitalism. All of a sudden, these great changes were happening. But what was happening was that now the socialists who are in power have state power in Russia. They take all these estates away from the landed feudal landlords. We know what feudalism is. We've talked about it over and over again. People trapped on the land. You just got a handful of people who own all the land, and the people are trapped on the land, can't do it. Now they got the land, and the land is being shared by peasants throughout. Not only that, they busted up the social relationships that were organized around feudalism. So as in the past, as opposed to the past, when only the nobility could go to school, get an education, go to college, become doctors, do all these other kinds of things. Now, ordinary people can do these things. So you got people who now can get education. Education, happens all over Russia. People now can become doctors, and they began curing illnesses that were difficult to handle before because of feudalism. They make another step into the modern world. But after a while, they still don't have access, and all of the white countries have isolated Russia, have created this economic quarantine so that the Soviet Union cannot compete with them, so the Soviet Union cannot succeed because they can't have the success of this thing, this workers' state, workers in power. So they do everything to disrupt this process and to keep it from being successful. And they provide a lot of economic strangulation for what is the Soviet Union, and political also, political isolation. Jobs, education, healthcare, housing, and a major thrust toward industrialization contributed to a rapid transformation of the conditions of existence for the Russian people. However, the massive resources poured into military industry necessary to protect the socialist state from a hostile capitalist world placed great limitations on what the overall productive capacity of the country and the socialist state could do for the people. The main contradiction, however, continued to be the existence of the capitalist world economy. The victory of the Russian Revolution resulted in the near absolute ostracization of Russia from participation in the world economy. While the capitalist world economy had the benefit of the captured resources of the bulk of the peoples and countries of the world, the so-called world trade that is a precondition for large-scale industry, Russia found itself essentially isolated. This fact meant its economy would quickly run into its limitations, stagnate and actually regress as long as the capitalists held sway worldwide. The growing successes in the struggles for national liberation are what has opened up this new epoch we are currently confronted with. The epoch that capitalist pundits and white nationalists, leftists, would mischaracterize as the epoch of socialism and crisis. We said the growing success of the struggles for national liberation what has opened up this whole new epoch. In the main resolution to our first Congress held in 1981, we correctly characterized this epoch even before specific features such as the capitulation of Russia and the Soviet bloc became clear. Here's what we said, quote, "The struggles of the world's peoples for national liberation, political independence, and economic and social justice have been going on for a long time, and they have clearly escalated since the Second Imperialist World War. However, the new current in the struggle of dependent countries and peoples, the current characterized by the struggle against neocolonialism, with a few exceptions, represent a new epoch in the struggle against world capitalism led by US imperialism. This new epoch is characterized by the struggles against neocolonialism, which embraces all those countries which have won the struggle against colonialism for political independence, and by the struggles against economic dependency, which embraces the peoples and countries which suffer from neocolonial oppression, as well as the people who still strain under the cruel weight of colonialism or political and economic dependency. This epoch of struggles and victories over neocolonialism and dependency became most notable and best defined by the revolutionary triumphs of the heroic people of Cuba, Vietnam, and Kampuchea. Most recently, our courageous sisters and brothers in Angola, Mozambique, Ethiopia, and Grenada, and the heroic peoples of Iran, Nicaragua, and El Salvador escalated this process in a critical way, throwing world capitalism led by US imperialism into an economic and political crisis from which it is desperately attempting to rescue itself, and which clearly determines the domestic policies of US and Western European imperialist powers. This epoch of struggles and victories over neocolonialism and dependency represents the leading revolutionary tendency in the world today. It is an epoch which finally thrusts humanity upon the threshold of world socialism, for it challenges the very foundation upon which world capitalism is built. This epoch of struggles and victories over neocolonialism and dependency directly threatens the primitive and non-capitalist accumulation of capital upon which capitalism was constructed and without which it cannot survive in its present form. Y'all with that? Yeah. During the period when the struggles against colonialism represent the main current in world history, the imperialist powers fell back on neocolonialism as the form for maintaining the oppressive exploitation of the world's fighting peoples and their resources. While colonialism reveals itself as the direct foreign political and economic domination of a people, neocolonialism disguises this domination by allowing nominal political independence. Under neocolonialism, imperialist rule is indirect and is carried out by indigenous imperialist puppets who administer a country, a government, and people for the imperialists who are able to continue indirect political domination through control of the economy. This form of exploitation allows imperialism to maintain a stranglehold on the world's peoples and their material resources. It also allows imperialism to stabilize its domestic rule during times of crisis through conceding more services and material benefits to workers within the imperialist center at the expense of increasingly brutal oppression and exploitation of the colonized, neo-colonized, and dependent peoples. We talk about maintaining and domestic stability. We're talking about like in America. Anybody, you know, if you have a child and had to deal with a balloon, you have a balloon that's not completely filled. You may have water, it may just be air, but if you squeeze it in a certain way, then the air frees from the place where you're squeezing it and then runs to another section of the balloon. You've done that before. And you squeeze it in the air, and this is how imperialism has functioned. And this is what the Marxists and those people who see the whole centrality of the white workers and the white bosses in the struggle against imperialism, this is where they don't get it. And so how, when the white workers in a place like America, they experience crisis, or in a place like Greece in the past, when the white workers would rise up because things were getting, the contradiction were deepening, what would happen is that the imperialists had the ability to push the contradictions to another sector of the capitalist world. So what happens is that that's when they talk about austerity for us. So they just simply cut back even more of what was coming to us, even though we are barely alive today. They try not to take it from the white people so that they can keep the contradictions from exploding domestically within their own societies. So they cut back in Africa. They take more from Africa, or in this country, they cut back on things like welfare and food stamps and all of that, and then push it back to the white people. They do things like create same-sex marriages to satisfy the white people, to keep the crisis from exploding in that fashion, and uniting the white people so that they can continue to contend with all these other areas of the balloon, if you will, of the world where contradictions are developing. And this is how they've been able to deal with it before. That's why African internationalism is so important, in part because we see the whole balloon, not just us as the important. We see the whole damn balloon. And we know that if we can create a situation where when they squeeze it and the air runs to this place, we're there too. You know, and there is no space here for them to occupy like that. So if you can start a situation where you make the air blow up in these areas where they're trying to, you know, shift the contradictions, then you can forward the revolutionary process. And that's essentially where we are increasingly moving. So this epoch of struggles and victories over neocolonialism and dependency increasingly narrows the profit-making and political options of imperialism. And that's what we're talking about with the bloom. It is an epoch of struggle which has thrust humanity upon the very threshold of a world struggle for socialism. It is an epoch of the ascendancy of the slave, one which characterized the world situation as generally good. So even though they're crying about, you know, the death of socialism, we have a completely different understanding of the situation. And that's why we're saying we cannot allow we cannot accept the crisis of imperialism as our crisis. That's their crisis. It's generally good. It's when your enemy is wounded and harmed, etc. It's good for you. You don't start, as Malcolm X would say, you know, rush to try to put out the fire in the master's house. You know, you pray for a breeze. You know. Anyway, so on page 53. White socialist theory marginalizes Africans is the subhead here. Before the advent of African internationalism, most communists held the view that socialism, the early stage of communism, where the state continues to temporarily exist as the workers in arms, would occur as a consequence of the development of internal contradictions within the industrial capitalist countries. That's an important paragraph, but I do want to say that we said something about socialism here. We said socialism, that socialism, the early stages of communism, where the state continues to temporarily exist as workers in arms. That's what socialism is. It's the early stage of communism, and the state continues to exist at this point. As the workers in arms. So it's no longer the bourgeois state, the capitalist state. The state now is an instrument of workers' power. So we can transform society so that it functions to benefit the working class, the colonized working class, as opposed to the oppressor. But we're saying that before the advent of African internationalism, most communists held the view that socialism, the early stages in communism, where the state continues to temporarily exist as the workers in power, would occur as a consequence of the development of internal contradiction within the industrial capitalist countries. This Eurocentric view, which marginalized the vast majority of the world's peoples, ascribing to us historically subordinate and auxiliary roles, saw as primary the contest between the white minority population of the world. However, this theory offers no explanation for how those of us whose misery constitutes the pedestal of world capitalism would ever be relieved of our wretched role. It doesn't give us an explanation, except the beneficence of the white workers when they come to power in this new socialist world. It doesn't. We don't have a role of our own. It's almost like what they're saying to like the place we are now, where if the white person get elected, then we can depend on them to solve the problem. We don't have no control over anything ourselves. We are just this sector of humanity that functions as an auxiliary to the interests of leading progressive white forces, in quotes. That's crazy. That's crazy. But you truly have to be an African internationalist to see it. Let's just say if you're using science, you don't have to be an African internationalist to assume that Black people can have power, but to have a scientific approach to it. I mean, you can conclude that because we got melanin and such a time, we can be powerful. It doesn't tell you how to do that, but melanin itself does it. It doesn't explain how, with all this damn melanin, white people was able to take over, you know. So this fallacious view even prevented the Soviets from understanding why they continued to have economic difficulties, which were theoretically only associated with capitalism. Because crisis, now Marx has always understood capitalism to be a crisis-ridden social system, crisis all the time. So how do Marxists, how do socialists then explain why the hell they're having all these economic contradictions? They can't explain it because they're not African internationalists. Thus, in the ideological war with the international bourgeoisie, the Soviets, in order to prove the superiority of what was being called socialism, hid the economic contradictions within their system and eventually became demoralized and perhaps even corrupted by failures they apparently did not fully understand. In explaining the success of the Russian Revolution of 1917, which defied the orthodox Marxist understanding that socialist revolution would occur in the highly developed capitalist countries, Lenin advanced the theory of the weak link, which, after the fact, permitted the occurrence of the revolution in economically backward Russia by characterizing Russia as the weak link in the capitalist chain. Do you understand what I'm saying? Yeah. So the imperialist crisis of today reveals that Russia continues to be the weak link in the capitalist chain due to its inability to participate fully and directly in the parasitic capitalist world economy. Therefore, although the entire capitalist system has been in a state of crisis for some time now, with many of the colonial countries so indebted to US and European parasitism, they are incapable of holding up their obligations to the industrialized capitalist countries, thereby threatening the stability of the international monetary system. It was the Soviets who capitulated first, before other European industrial societies opting to join the capitalist world economy. Thus, the heirs to the first great attempt at socialism joined the feast of the flesh of the world's oppressed peoples in order to solve its own economic and political problems. Such a move, sacrificing the long-term interests of the revolution for the short-term interests of a sector of the working class, is defined as opportunism. Hence, the pathetic plea by Soviet President Gorbachev to join the Industrial Monetary Fund and World Bank and to participate in the general agreement on taxes and tariffs, or the international monetary system, which, while experiencing the stress of a more diversified capitalist leadership, remains nevertheless a capitalist international monetary system used to further enslave the colonized world. Hence, the mad rush by the Russians and Eastern Europeans into the orgy of consumerism that characterizes their rich white kith and kin of Western Europe and the US of North America. The domestic struggles against Russia and Eastern European communism continues to reveal itself as the struggle for the possession of things, VCRs, color TVs, and the like, that other white people long ago accepted as their just right, due to them because of their whiteness. So they want to get a part of it too. Have you ever noticed this? Some of you have had an opportunity, even more recently, to see starving, desperate people fleeing, horrible conditions in these places, right? And you see, you look at them, what they're wearing, the clothes they got on, you say, damn, these are starving, desperate people, and you look at what you see like in Africa, that's accepted as norm. And, sometimes it's hard to get your head wrapped around it. Even some people that I've seen coming from certain places in the Middle East, you look at them and their desperate situation does not compare at all to the desperation that you see as normal on the continent of Africa. I mean that literally speaking, but anyway, you had all these European forces, who saw they wanted to be consumers. That was one of the big problems in Russia, consumerism, because they, saw all this other stuff that white countries had. There's this great iconic moment in this contest in the Cold War between the Soviet Union and Western Europe, specifically the United States. And it was at some World Fair someplace. I don't remember where it was. But Richard Nixon was there, and he was going through this stuff and showing the washing machines and refrigerators and all the stuff that you could have in the United States. And Khrushchev, who at the time was the prime minister of the Soviet Union. And, you know, and when people saw the stuff that the United States, even Khrushchev, I think, was taken aback by all of this consumerism. And this became a thing. How can we provide all these consumer goods, you know, for like people in the Soviet Union? Because they didn't have this stuff and they couldn't have it. There's no way in hell they could have it unless they invaded Grenada. And Grenada was too small to provide, unless they invaded some other African or they were able to become a part of this whole looting process. So anyway, in '54, opportunists worked with imperialism. V.I. Lenin, the leader of the Russian Revolution in 1917, had begun to recognize some of the impediments to socialist revolution in Europe before his untimely death in 1924. While he had not come to understand the centrality of the anti-colonialist revolution in the struggle against the imperialist bourgeoisie, he did understand that the relationship the white workers of Europe and North America forged with peoples suffering from colonialism would ultimately determine the revolutionary character of white workers. In his pamphlet, Imperialism and the Split in Socialism, Lenin spoke of the opportunists of his day 70 years ago. Well, it's more than 70 since now, it's 100 years ago. Lenin's words still hold true, not only for European and North American opportunists in general, but also for Russian and East European opportunists as well. His words describe precisely what Gorbachev and Eastern European leaders and people are about during the so-called crisis of socialism. The opportunists, social chauvinists, are working hand in glove, this is quoting Lenin, with the imperialist bourgeoisie precisely toward creating an imperialist Europe on the backs of Asia and Africa. And objectively, the opportunists are a section of the petty bourgeoisie and a certain strata of the working class who have been bribed out of imperialist super profits and converted into watchdogs of capitalism and corruptors of the labor movement. The proletariat is the child of capitalism, of world capitalism, and not only of European capitalism. On a world scale, 50 years sooner or 50 years later, measured on a world scale, this is a minor point, the proletariat, of course, will be united and revolutionary social democracy will inevitably be victorious within it. But that is not the point. By advocating unity with the opportunists, you are objectively defending the enslavement of the workers by the imperialist bourgeoisie with the aid of its best agents in the labor movement. The victory of revolutionary social democracy on a world scale is absolutely inevitable. Only it is moving and will move, is proceeding and will proceed against you. It will be a victory over you. On the one hand, there is the tendency of the bourgeoisie and the opportunists to convert a handful of very rich and privileged nations into eternal parasites on the body of the rest of mankind, to rest on the laurels of the exploitation of Negroes, Indians, etc., keeping them in subjection with the aid of the excellent weapons of extermination provided by modern militarism. On the other hand, there is the tendency of the masses who are more oppressed than before and who bear the whole brunt of imperialist wars to cast off this yoke and overthrow the bourgeoisie. That's the quote from Lenin. That's a good quote. Russia, which lost its membership in the white capitalist world economy through the attempt by Russian revolutionaries to overthrow capitalism with the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, and which has no real colonies. East Europe, some of which has lost its colonial possessions and membership in the white capitalist world economy through its association with the Soviet Union after the Second Imperialist World War, chose opportunism over revolution as a means of economic development. They are rushing to rejoin the white capitalist parasitic world economy, resting again quoting Lenin, on the backs of Asia and Africa, and based on the exploitation of Negroes, Indians, etc., who are kept in subjection with the aid of excellent weapons of extermination provided by modern militarism. And then the next part of this chapter, capitalist ideology, which is white racism, has long held that the origin of the world's political economy, especially the wealth of whites, is a consequence of hardworking, thrifty, and intellectually superior white people, the frugal elite that Marx talked about. However, the economic stagnation of Russia and East Europe, once it was no longer a part of the world's white capitalist parasitic economy, is evidence of where the real basis of international white capitalist development is located. I just want to say this: if you want to know what Europe would be and America would be without colonies and exploitation of other peoples, then the best example of that is what did occur in Russia and what did occur in the so-called Eastern Europe. Once they no longer had access, once Europeans no longer have access to the colonies and what have you, decline is automatic. The collapse of the Soviet Union is the clearest example, clearest evidence of the validity of our understanding of African internationalism, because it was denied the pedestal. It was denied access to the looting process of that took all these resources from Africa and even from the Americas. I mean, just give it some thought. You know, we talked about primitive accumulation. You have to include in the discussion of primitive accumulation the entire continent of North America, the entire continent of South America. You have to include New Zealand, Australia into this primitive accumulation. Just think about this. If Europe and white people did not have America, what they now call America, if this were a free land of the indigenous peoples, did not have all access to all these resources, they're bleeding out of Africa. If they could not have gone to Australia, if they could not have gone to New Zealand, I mean, what Europe are you talking about? What in the hell are you looking at? If France was not feeding off the flesh of African people all on the continent of Africa, what would it look like today? I mean, this is what you and I have the ability to understand. And it's really interesting because it's like they always say, you know, the slave master always say, look at how much I do for you, the slave. But it's the slave who kept the whole damn thing running, who feeds the slave master, feed the children and everything else. And that's how the whole white world, all of the white world, socialists, communists, if you want to call them that, social democrats, right wing, left wing, see themselves in relationship to Africa and the rest of the world. They see themselves as the center of everything that's developed, everything that they've got. They dismiss, liquidate the history that gave them everything through slavery and what have you. And and they are civilized, and we are the savage barbarians and the rest of that. And we do act savagely from time to time because we'll catch your grandmama in the dark and take her purse, and if she resists, we'll break her arm. I mean, this is the kind of thing that happens, you know, because you've taken everything. You got all people enslaved, and people who are enslaved don't even understand why they poor. Right. Why there's no you got it, and I don't. You know, you can feed your children, I can't. And your grandmama, you know, the Second Amendment people are right. Usually speaking, your 83-year-old grandmama doesn't have a gun when she's in the dark, as opposed to the police and other kind of folks. So it's an easier target. But the point is, people have this relationship, and they, you know, they're trying to explain and understand why these people are blowing us up in Belgium, and we're so nice. We are nice in Belgium. And, you know, all we want to do is, you know, have tea in the cafes and go to, you know, this, you know, concerts and stuff, just enjoy life, you know, and we can't even enjoy life anymore because people are blowing us up, and they've liquidated this whole relationship. They've liquidated the whole relationship. They've defined the entire world to speak to meet their needs and their aspirations. And you think about this. When a white person anywhere on the earth makes plans or really thinks about being successful in the world, on a great future for my child, I've stashed this money over here, I've done this, and etc. For them to be successful, for them to have what it is that they dream and aspire, they have to keep the rest of us oppressed like this. Every aspiration, every dream of a future that white people have requires them to be killing people with drones and stuff throughout, North Africa and the Middle East. And it requires all those people who are trying to escape the bombs and stuff in Syria, hopping on these, trying to get through Europe out of the place, or all these people on the continent of Africa, dragging their children behind them if they're lucky enough, crossing an entire damn continent, thousands and thousands of miles to get to the Mediterranean to try to get to safety in Europe, where their resources have created safety, generally speaking, for white people. And they'll say, well, I didn't do it. I'm not responsible. I didn't know anything about this. And what's really interesting is, because in European society, they say ignorance of the law. What they say, I mean, that's no excuse. Ignorance of the law is not a defense. And the point is that each of us, is capable of seeing somebody starving and impoverished. We see the starvation, and sometimes say, we don't want to see that. I don't like that, because don't show me that kind of news. But you have to ask the question, if you're a human being anywhere, why are they starving? Why is there such a grim and distinct kind of existence for them as compared to me? You have to do that. You have to be the most narcissistic, self-serving person on earth not to ask that question. Why are they starving like this? And if you ask that question, when a white person looks in the mirror, I mean, you and I have these images of white people and things like that. But when they look in the mirror, when they compare themselves to themselves, when they compare themselves to other white people, they know they ain't shit. You understand? When the person look in the mirror, they know that, okay, I know exactly what's looking back at me. I know me. I know I don't know nothing, et cetera, et cetera. I know me when I look at me. It's only when they look at you, they need you, who they've defined to be this inferior entity that's automatic. It's a given that they know more than you. It's an automatic, it's a given that they know more than you, they're more civilized than you, they're more intelligent than you, etc. But when they have to deal otherwise, so they lie to themselves, and they know that there must be some rational explanation for why I live this way and other people can't live this way, unless they've been absolutely separated from their humanity. And of course, that's one of the things that white nationalist and imperialist ideology does, is separate white people from their humanity, just as it separates us from our humanity. Even the much touted 18th century revolutions in Europe and North America that marked a turning point in the transformation of the entire white world, overthrowing European feudalism and introducing democracy and the capitalist mode of production that created both the modern white ruling class and its antipode, the white working class, needed African slavery and Indian genocide as its foundation. Needed that. Couldn't have had it without that. The ability of the European merchant class to overthrow and replace the European nobility was based on the extra societal strength this fledgling social formation achieved through primitive accumulation, that accumulation of capital preceding capitalist production, and accumulation not the result of the capitalist mode of production, but a starting point. The white capitalist parasitic world economy that the Russians and East Europeans are rushing to rejoin requires world slavery for its existence. When the Soviet Union, under the leadership of V.I. Lenin, was a revolutionary state, it was because it fought for the existence of a world economy that would allow for the real producers, the toiling masses of the world, to commonly own and control the product of their common labor. Lenin fought for a worldwide movement of laborers, the workers, and all the toiling masses who would rise up and overthrow the capitalist system. This worldwide movement to overthrow capitalism is the only way the wretched conditions of the world's peoples can be permanently overcome. To the extent the subsequent Soviet governments gave assistance to the worldwide struggles for national liberation, they contributed to the process which will ultimately overthrow capitalism and the basis of the economic contradictions currently being experienced by Russia and Eastern Europe. However, the Russians and Eastern Europeans have chosen instead to abandon the cause of the wretched toilers of Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the internal colonies of the white capitalist countries. They have chosen to join the privileged white workers in its losing attempt to keep the parasitic pedestal of capitalism, which is to say, white power, in place. In the case of China, whose heroic people made a great revolution which revealed the revolutionary possibilities of colonially oppressed peoples throughout the world, their current efforts at economic development have been characterized by our party as being like the efforts of someone trapped in a hole attempting to get out by climbing up on his own back. China is one of those countries whose level of economic development is directly tied to its history as host to European economic parasitism. The British Opium War constituted the blatant British capture of primitive accumulation through a drug trade that Britain forced on China. China's wretched conditions of existence are therefore due to the same historical causes as those in the rest of Asia, as well as in Africa and Latin America. However, China's revolution in 1949 extricated China from the negative relationship with parasitic world of capitalism and allowed China, like Russia before it, to make some immediate changes in the interests of the Chinese masses, although not without contradictions. China's current treacherous political collaboration with Western imperialism reflects the growing voluntary reintroduction of China into the capitalist world economy, although this time its current leadership intends for China to play the role of parasite instead of host. In other words, China also intends to transform its material conditions of existence, not through revolution to overthrow capitalism, but through joining imperialism at the trial. While the Russians, East Europeans, and Chinese have in the past referred to themselves as socialist states, they have never actually presided over socialist economies, the historical basis for which continues to unfold even now. Therefore, the crises experienced by any or all of these economies have actually been crises inherent to capitalism and not in socialism. Moreover, the political crisis experienced by any or all of these states are crises due in part, in great measure, to the inability of a capitalist economy to solve the problems in society. While the Soviets and China, to a lesser degree, have been actively involved with the US, Western, and Japanese imperialism in attempting to manage the world, to maintain what can be called worldwide imperialist stability, their efforts will only prove to be futile, as the oppressed and subject workers and peoples of the colonial world are not sympathetic to any deals made which would compromise our just struggles to overthrow our oppression and subjugation. Moreover, in spite of difficulties our struggles might experience due to the Soviet, East European, and Chinese defections, we will nevertheless see a rapid development of the independent struggles for national liberation now that they are unencumbered by Chinese and especially Soviet or Russian opportunism. The rising up of the slave, organized and armed with the theory of African internationalism, and poised for the final defeat of the parasitic world capitalist system, marks a new page in world history. And that's the end of this chapter. But I want to make this comment because it is true. The end of the Soviet Union did not end the struggle of the masses of the people of the world. It escalated it. If you look around, the crisis that they're confronted with today is that the Soviet Union and all of its opportunism, all of its attempt to control the struggles of the peoples around the world, they had, when I say it's opportunism, you have to understand that the Soviet Union had also controlled much of the so-called communist movement outside of Russia and the Soviet Union itself. In the United States, Communist Party USA, all these other places, even in the Middle East, you had these communist parties, and they were all connected to the Soviet Union. At one time, they had been connected to what was called the Communist International, that was organized in 1919 by Russia. Later on, Stalin in the 1940s made deals to try to get along with Western imperialist powers after the going into the Second Imperialist War. I think something like 1942, they formally dissolved the Communist International that was headquartered in the Soviet Union. But the Russia still the Soviet Union still controlled its parties out here. In fact, since 1917, up until its dissolution, the Soviet Union gave the Communist Party USA at least $1 million a year. And that's the minimum that it gave to them. I mean, they didn't put it in the bank and send it to them. They brought it over in pouches and diplomatic pouches and stuff like that by diplomats who were coming to this country. And they didn't just give it to give that kind of money to so-called communists in the United States. They gave them and supported forces all around the world. And because of this, they were able to influence how struggle was happening in all these different places. And these struggles were happening in a way that was beneficial to the state interests of the Soviet Union and did not necessarily forward the revolutionary objective of the people. And it was also informed by this false assumption that somehow Moscow and white workers were the center of the world, and everybody else functioned as sort of an auxiliary. And as soon as the Soviet Union collapsed, you didn't see the collapse of struggle. You saw what was pushed aside were those forces who were most closely aligned with the Soviet Union. The communist parties that they dominated were no longer as significant anymore, and other forces were able to rise up. And some of these were not Marxists, and perhaps the majority of them were not Marxists. They were Muslims, they were jihadists, they were all these other kind of forces. They're out there, but they're wreaking more havoc for imperialism around the world today than all these communist parties that the Soviets were dealing with up until that point. And the other thing that must be understood is that even though the United States and the rest of them talked about the Cold War and this struggle that was happening between the Soviets and the United States or Europe, you won't find evidence of the Russians and the United States fighting each other. What made it significant was because the Soviet would sometimes give arms and training to the colonized. And they were a problem, not because Russia was going to make a war with them, but because Russia might fund somebody who was making war against them in Angola. Russia gave arms and support to people in Cuba. It's the colonized. It's the relationship that Russia had to the colonized that made them a threat, which again simply reaffirms, validates African internationalism. So I wanted to go ahead and say that, and I think we do have time to have some meaningful discussion. I know that people are there waiting to talk, and so we're going to unmute now and invite
all callers are muted.
Invite people to join into the discussion.
All callers are unmuted.
Let me do this before I ask you to say anything. I want to do a kind of a roll call, and if I don't call your name, I'd like for you to let me know that you're on. I have Ona, Mike Love, Berdora, Makta, Maureen, Deborah, Stephanie, Penny, Kilolo, Alikia, Kitty, Ruby, Mtambwe, Gazi, Akile, Liu, Star, Fofi, Alienza, Ali, Ineko, Desun, Temba, Muteba, Kalambayi, Unique, Kabula, Taylor, Rafiq, who is this after Rafiq? D-O-N, Donna. Who else? Whose name did I not call? Diop. I heard Fosia. Ikinge. Janice. Who is that? K-Fing.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
Abraham.
Abraham.
Yes.
Uhuru, come man.
Who?
Anybody else?
Addition.
Who is that? Adissa.
Addition.
Anybody else? All right. So I want to open it up for discussion. And if there's a particular page or something that you want to reference, indicate that too. That'll help us all. But let's open it up for discussion. It's yours, Uhuru. Oh, Ntamwe. Uhuru.
Okay, I want to be correct. Socialism requires the destruction. True socialism requires the destruction of capitalism. That's part of it. And my question would be like, so there in history, what we know has there ever been a true socialism?
There hasn't been a true socialist state. And what we're saying here is that there's been a socialist state. The Soviets had a socialist state. The Chinese had a socialist state. The Cubans a socialist state. The Vietnamese a socialist state. But which only means that you have a situation where the conditions were right, the contradictions were such that socialists could take power. But socialism is not simply socialists in power. Socialism, you're talking about a social system, an economic system. And even though you had Vietnamese and Cubans and Chinese and Russians who took power, the world economy continued to be a capitalist world economy. So you had these little islands in this whole sea of capitalism, in many ways, of socialism on lifeboats in a turbulent sea of capitalism. And so what we're saying is, and we quoted Marx earlier, when he told us that the capitalism and what he referred to as wage slavery, requiring as a pedestal slavery pure and simple. This is the requirement of capitalist production, capitalist existence, was this slavery pure and simple. Be developed and translated into colonialism all around the world. And this is what fed the whole capitalist system. And this is why the Soviets have problems, the Chinese have problems, the Cubans have problems, the Vietnamese problem, while Vietnam is even entering all kinds of trade agreements right now with the United States, because there's still a world capitalist social system. So the conditions for the conditions were right for socialists to take power, but the historical basis for the advent of socialism, which is the destruction of the pedestal, that did not exist, and that is something that's unfolding even as we have this discussion. That's what makes, even though we've got non-socialists and sometimes religious fanatics and all these other people struggling all over the Middle East and people all around the world, they represent this pedestal that's in struggle against this relationship they have with capitalism. They don't call it capitalism, they might call it infidels, they might call it all other kinds of things, but that's what this struggle is. And the weakness of those movements, of course, is that they do not have consciousness of socialism as an aim and their relationship with the rest of the world. The weakness of those movements is that they are informed by some kind of religious interpretation of the world as opposed to an historical materialist understanding. Uhuru.
Uhuru, I guess it's like a three-part question. First of all, what is Tsarism? And if it's a difference between what feudalism is as opposed to wage slavery. And earlier you mentioned the term wage slavery. Is that a term that can still apply to today? And if so, what is the major difference from when you first mentioned when wage slavery was and to today?
Well, first of all, Tsarism is feudalism. Then you just say Tsarism because that's the Tsar in Russia. They call what would be the king or something like that in Russia was the Tsar. So Tsarism equates with feudalism. Secondly, wage slavery is simply a term that was used by communists and Marxists and socialists and other white people to refer to how exploitative working under capitalism was. You got a job, you become a wage slave. And the thing that makes that a really interesting concept is because you're a wage slave when they saw slavery as something that most of us African people were confronted with. So it's a term that was used then. It's not, as far as I'm concerned, has, you know, about as much value as a glass of snot. But, you know, it's just one of those terms that white people use that places them in the center in a certain way. They talk about wage slavery, and which was a way of saying that white people catching hell too. That's really what it was about, you know, Uhuru. And so as far as I'm concerned, it's nothing, you know, I mean, people can use it and people have used it and probably still use it, wage slavery as a concept. And it has as much value now as it did then. Uhuru. Anybody else? Uhuru. Akile, yeah. You gotta speak loud enough so they can hear you on the phone too, yeah.
Uhuru. I want to appreciate you, Chairman, for this study. And there was a part where you was like, "Did everybody got that?" And no, I didn't have it. It was on page 48, and I may just have gotten like lost in the way he talks.
Yeah, he does. Yeah.
Yeah, and so it was primitive accumulation plays in political. Not the entire thing, because I get the part where when you break it down about political economy being the same as the original sin and theology. But I just got confused, I guess, towards the end of that middle paragraph, where it's like, and from this original sin dates the poverty of the great majority. Despite all its labor has up to now nothing to sell but itself and the wealth of the few that increases constantly. Although they have long ceased to work, such insipid childishness is every day preached to us in defense of property. I just didn't understand. I got confused towards that part.
Yeah, he was just saying that, you know, the silliness of even, you know, the biblical thing, the original sin, you know, because women tricked Adam, you know, y'all are the key. So, tricked Adam to eating. You know what the so-called the fruit? It was not an apple. It was not a fig. No. God punished Adam and punished all of them because it was a fruit from the tree of knowledge, which tells you something about your religion. Anyway, so of course you ain't supposed to know nothing. But anyway, it's and when they violated this thing, this was the original sin, first sin. God said, "Don't mess with knowing something." And Eve, you know, the serpent, you know, pimped up and got Eve to get Adam, you know, to eat of the fruit. And then after that, they didn't even know they was naked up until that time. And then they, you know, that's where all of the horrors, you know, now you're cast out of the Garden of Eden. You gotta get a job. You understand all of this, and so that's the story. You know, like that's the thing that plunged humanity according to original sin into these difficult circumstances. And the way the economists have told the story is that you got these frugal people who save and do everything and thrifty, etc. And that's how they get wealth. Yet the people who don't have long ceased working, they continue to get wealth and etc. And he's just trying to use this analogy, this biblical analogy about original sin to explain the existence of of the people who sin and therefore catch hell, and people who don't sin, and it's just as silly. I think that's the basic point that he's trying to make. Say, you know, never mind. And there's a point that goes in never mind. And the Marx and many of European philosophers did speak in strange ways. There was a certain language that philosophers are highly influenced by the French. And often only they could understand what the hell they were saying, just in the way they were saying. But that's essentially what they were saying. That original sin, this is the explanation for original sin, why everybody catching hell and poor. And that there's an equivalency there about why people ain't got nothing. Capitalism provides for you to have everything, but if you don't have it, it's because you somehow are sinful. You're not frugal, you're not thrifty, while you're not smart. While the smart, frugal, thrifty people have everything, and that's the analogy that he was making there. Anybody else? Gazi.
Patrice Lumumba went to the Soviet Union, right? Like he turned to the Soviet Union for assistance.
They can't hear you here. Yeah.
That Patrice Lumumba turned to the Soviet Union for assistance, but wasn't it like they said something around they were assisting people with fighting colonialism, but not neocolonialism? And what Patrice Lumumba was dealing with was neocolonialism.
I don't know if that was the absolute statement that they made, but I do know, in fact, that some junctures, I'm told the Soviets did say, okay, let's do something here. But I think that it was more complicated than that. I think the problem is that by now the Soviet Union is this place that's more concerned with its own state interests, as opposed to this notion of the revolutionary workers of the world and even supporting the colonial people. And in fact, they had gone through this period where sometimes I hear people now, even a part of the so-called Black movement, who tell us that, you got to have this united front against fascism, right? So, and they had gone through a period where the Soviet Union, Communist International, controlled by the Soviet Union, had declared, this is during the Second Imperialist War, that they had to have this united front against fascism. So the Soviets went into this relationship with the United States, with Britain, with all these other countries that were colonial powers. These were colonial powers. Soviet Union is doing this to defend itself from Hitler, and the West, the white world in the West, are actually doing things to try to have Hitler and Russia take the brunt of the war, here. And so going into the 60s, even the Soviets are trying to have this relationship with the white world, and they raised, they did funny stuff that were unprincipled and opportunistic, and that was in Africa was one of those places, and they would measure what they could get out of it versus what they were going to have to pay for it. And of course, the Cuba thing, you're looking at a time where even the Cuban Missile Crisis, if it had not happened, was right around the corner, where the Soviets had put up missiles in Cuba. So it was a real war. That they call it the Cold War because it hadn't actually broken out until an absolute actual war. And I think the Soviet Union acted opportunistically and participated in and contributed to allowing the Congo to go the way it went. And even before that, I mean, the kind of assistance that the Soviets refused to give the Chinese at a certain time during the Chinese Revolution, there are those examples. And part of it is that part of it is the logic of this whole notion that the revolution was centered in this contest between the industrial white working class and industrial bourgeoisie. Because otherwise, they would have been able to see it was to their advantage to feed this revolutionary thing that was happening in all these other places. To some extent, Cuba saw that, which is one of the reasons that Che was all over South America trying to make revolution happen throughout South America, because Cuba by itself couldn't hang. And while even Che went into Africa to try to facilitate a continental-wide, revolutionary movement throughout the continent of Africa, because he knew they couldn't survive like that, or it was very difficult for them to survive like that. Cuba formed alliances with Grenada, and this was also an attempt to end Cuban isolation. Cuba, at one point, there was Cuba, there was Grenada, and even in Jamaica with Michael Manley, there were these three forces out there in the Caribbean that looked like, they could, have a formidable kind of front that could do some things to weather this aggression from the United States. Uhuru.
Got some questions off YouTube.
YouTube question.
Yeah, we got it yesterday. She says during the 60s, 70s, and 80s, African wage struggle against direct colonial rule, some under the banner of socialism. In your opinion, was there ever any true socialist anti-colonial struggles in Africa?
That's a good question. Because in Africa, what we saw was the African petty bourgeoisie that had been radicalized. And the difficulty the African petty bourgeoisie was confronted with as a social force, as a petty bourgeoisie, is that all of the colonial powers that they were fighting against were being supported by other imperialist powers. So when they were fighting against Portuguese were supported by the United States, South Africa supported by the United States, the South African regime, apartheid regime, all of them were supported by these imperialist powers. So they couldn't get any support. You understand? When the neocolonialists wanted to overturn this colonial relationship, the so-called revolutionaries, where are they going to get support? They don't, no matter how capitalist they are, America was not going to help them overthrow these colonial powers. England was not going to help them overthrow Portugal or something like that. So where are they going to get support? Only place they could get support is from either the Soviet Union or Russia. Well, you can't say, look, I'm a capitalist and I'm trying to overthrow this or that in order to get support from them. You become a Marxist too. You become what's necessary to get that support. It's opportunism, neocolonial petty bourgeois opportunism throughout the continent of Africa. The few exceptions would have been Nkrumah, who had not yet become a socialist revolutionary, but who was an incredible in terms of moving forward and even tried to stay out of this thing between the Soviet Union and the United States, coming up and participating in the creation of the non-aligned movement. That's not aligned with the Soviet Union, not aligned with the United States, etc. And so that's what we had. And some people say, well, we saw in situations like Angola, the rise of UNITA, which was black nationalist speaking force that was working with the CIA, the South African government, the Portuguese itself, that was supposedly fighting for liberation in Angola. You had in Mozambique, I think it was FLIC. I can't remember the acronyms for all of them, but they were also working with groups like the South African and CIA. So they're working with the South African CIA, so they must be, they're the enemy, they are the sellouts, the lickspittles, they are the neocolonialists. But these forces over here, because they're close to China, because they're close to the Soviet Union, they take a Marxist Pan-Africanist line, they're all right. And that was just wrong all up and down the line, because in Angola, in Mozambique, people who are in power now are people who were declared to be the preeminent socialists on the continent of Africa. Uhuru. I think an example of difference, I should have mentioned Lumumba, because I don't think Lumumba had no pretensions of being some kind of revolutionary communist or something to that effect. But he was definitely an African patriot in the deepest sense of the word, and was working with Nkrumah and wanted to see a united Africa. I mean, that's for sure about Lumumba.
How would you consider Thomas Sankara or Amilcar Cabral in that question?
Well, Sankara was a magnificent soldier of Africa, and he definitely, I think, would have been considered a socialist revolutionary. the difference in Sankara and some of the others is that Sankara did not come to power as a part of the consequent, as part of the struggle against direct colonialism. He came to power in the struggle against neocolonialism. And so, but I agree that Sankara would definitely have been distinguished differently. Certainly in terms of his position against struggle against neocolonialism and for the dignity of African people. I would have, so I say that. And also Amilcar Cabral was an amazing and important force, but I thought he was very narrow in some ways. We quote Cabral. We think that he made some really important kinds of contributions, but Cabral did not have the ability to see the struggle even of African people in this country as being against colonialism. He felt like we were struggling to become some part of some kind of the working class in this country. It was an interesting debate either that he had with Eldridge Cleaver, of all persons, around this whole question, and Cabral was dead wrong on the question. And I do think Cabral was a significant and very important force, and I would not have placed him in the category of opportunist or neocolonialist.
All right, we got another from YouTube.
Uhuru?
Hello, Chairman.
Yes, comrade.
Can you,
Who is this? I want him to
this
say.
is Otika.
Okay, Uhuru Oteka. You're out of New York, right? Go ahead.
Yes. I was talking to someone and they had mentioned that somehow the Moors were in some way like capitalists, and I argue that they weren't. You know, capitalism came as a result of, you know, the Europeans' attack on Africa and so on and so forth. But they insisted that the Moors were like in some way an early capitalist force. Can you expound on that at all?
No, except that capitalism as we know it, as a social system, capitalism as a social system was born as a world system. So there was no, even though it could be argued that in some peculiar, limited circumstances and places, that some people participated in what might otherwise be called capitalist production. But when we talk about capitalism as a social system, it is a social system that was given birth through slavery, through colonialism, etc. And I haven't done enough studies of the specifics of the Moors. And when you raise the question Moors, of course, it can get a little hairy because this whole thing that has been invented to try and explain the reality and situation of African people from the mythological Moorish thing. Moors were absolutely, truly, you know, like real, but it's gone some strange places. So I don't have a good answer for that, except for what I've already said about the origin of capitalism as we know it. There was no Moors that created capitalism as we know it. The capitalism that we know and experience in the world today was born as a world system that came about as a consequence of slavery and colonialism. That I can say for certain. We have a YouTube question.
Yes, Lofton Emaneri. Who did not Stalin send Russia into a totalitarian state until Khrushchev managed it back to real socialism state?
Well, you know, a lot of people hate Stalin's guts. And let me just say this. I'm not here to defend Stalin or Khrushchev or anybody like that. My explanation for what happened with the Soviet Union stands that it was surrounded by imperialism from its very inception. Instead of being able, even if all other conditions were good, instead of being able to initiate a socialist society, a socialist production that took care of the mass of the people, Russia was immediately surrounded. Even in 1917, even with the revolution, it was invaded by several imperialist countries, including the United States. And so for most of its inception, Russia was surrounded. Instead of resources being able to go to the development of Russian society, Russian education, Russian production, and stuff like that, it went to building arms, guns, and other kinds of soldiers, and a whole bloated military budget to try to defend itself from the imperialists. And Stalin was one of the main forces who had this responsibility of defense of the Soviet Union. And Stalin has been accused of committing all kinds of offenses in the process of doing that, some of which he may have actually been guilty. But the biggest crime Stalin committed from the perspective of most of the bourgeoisie and its supporters is that he maintained the survival of the Soviet Union in the face of all the aggression that was coming. And there was massive aggressions. They talked about Stalin being paranoid. He had good reason to be paranoid. The US and other imperialist countries doing everything they could inside the Soviet Union, all around, to try to undermine and destroy that regime. So in terms of Khrushchev restoring something to the true socialism, that's certainly not the case. I mean, Khrushchev was just another face for Soviet politicians and leaders trying to manage an economy and a state in a sea of imperialist economics and politics. And they went from one end to the other, backwards and forth, because they didn't have a good explanation for what was going on. So I don't give Khrushchev any kudos as opposed to Stalin. In fact, if anything, Stalin probably saved the Soviet Union. Lenin, I think, would have been a much better force, but Lenin was dead in 1924. And Stalin, the US, and all of Europe manipulated the situation that left Stalin carrying the brunt of the war against this World War II. Most people live in this country thinking America played such a heroic role in World War II. That's not true. America didn't even enter the war until something like 1943. The Soviets lost 50 million people in that war. It was they who broke the back of Hitler, destroyed the Nazi regime and what have you, because of how, in part, the US, Churchill, and a whole bunch of them allowed this thing to unfold so that the Russia would catch the brunt of this war against Nazi Germany. And the objective was to have the Soviet Union destroyed. And Stalin is the one who held the fort and led the whole struggle that defeated Hitler and the Nazis. So, in terms of Khrushchev rescuing socialism, the true socialism, I don't think I agree with that. And it's not a statement that's pro-Stalin. I do know that most people hated Stalin because if it had not been for Stalin under those circumstances, the Soviet Union wouldn't have existed as long as it did. So it's now late, and I think what we have to do is, what are you going to say, Timber? Let me deal with the one more. That's it. We got to get to the announcements and shut it down.
All right, we got Omali, yeah. What is North America and Europe's next move as they attempt to preserve power?
Well, you're looking at it all around you. It's unending war. They don't have it's unending war, and they keep African and oppressed people locked into an assumption that the solution to our problem, the way forward for us, is their way. And their way means that we fight for France, we fight for the United States, we fight for Germany, that we become members of the Democratic Party or even the Green Party, anything other than becoming able of recognizing our own interests. So it is in a state of real desperation, a serious crisis. And unending war is one thing that you can continue to look for. It doesn't matter if it's Trump. People are talking about war is us if Trump is elected, but Hillary Clinton had just had a convention comprised on that platform, mostly generals and what have you. They have a situation where they're going to have to push the people back into colonial slavery, or they're going to have to all start passing out their resumes to see if they can get a job in the new world that they're faced with right now. So I want to go ahead and move this forward. I wasn't an adequate explanation, but I didn't have any time actually to take that. So I want to make announcements. One thing I really want to say, comrades, brothers, sisters, everybody who is a part of this, is on November 5th and 6th, we're going to be in Washington, D.C. for the Black People's Convention. And the Black People's Convention is a 2-day convention that's happening in Washington, D.C. It's a convention of resistance. I've heard people say that on one day we're going to have a rally, and then we're going to have a march, and then we're going to go to the convention. No, the rally and the march are part of the Black People's Convention. That's a convention of slaves. It's a convention of fighting. And so it's not just a sitting down and simply passing resolutions. We're going to go on that march, and this is something where Africans from throughout the United States will be coming together. We've had some state convention. We had one state convention at least on yesterday, maybe more. Maybe there were 2, but certainly a Florida state convention. I think there may be a state convention happening today. And I know all the way up until the 11th, there are going to be state conventions in different places. Florida was one. Texas is another. Alabama is another. Kansas is one. New Jersey is one. Missouri is one. Washington, D.C., Pennsylvania. So these state conventions are going to be happening and pulling people together to unite with the platform, the agenda that's been organized already for Black self-determination. And so everybody should be in motion, There's no excuse for not being at this convention. Everybody in this meeting definitely ought to be there. And that's a critical thing. So I just wanted to say that people should be working to get there. And you can get more information by going to blackisbackcoalition.org for more information. You should go there, and you should go ahead and register to indicate that you're going to be there, so we can know how many hundreds of people will be at this extraordinarily important event. Be there. So that's one thing I want to announce. On today in St. Petersburg, Florida, at 4 o'clock, and we're going to be streaming this too, there's a Day in Solidarity with African People, something that's mandated for the African People Solidarity Committee to do annually. It's in the Constitution, and it may even be in our Constitution, that annually this is what the African People Solidarity Committee. And that's the only thing that's about, is winning other white people and other people to solidarity with the struggle of our people here. And that's going to be happening at Aquaba Hall in St. Petersburg, Florida at 4 o'clock today. If you're in the neighborhood, come to the Uhuru House. Even if you're not too far away, come to the Uhuru House and participate in that. I will be speaking, and incredible Kunde Mwambita will also be speaking. Of course, she's the mother of the 3 girls that were murdered by the Pinellas County Sheriff's Department. And like she said, we're going to get that ass. So those are a couple of announcements. There are going to be other Day in Solidarity actions throughout the country that will be occurring as well. Any other announcements? You got any announcement for Sia or Makta out of Sweden? No?
No, we don't have any announcements, specific announcements.
Okay.
Just want to let everybody know, keep your heads up for the 2017 plenary coming in January. Start making your plans to save your monies and get your flights or whatever it may be. It's going to be, I'm not sure the dates, and Kinge might, but I know it's coming up in January, first week of January. Petersburg, Florida. Yep. The
Burning Spear, new Burning Spear will be out momentarily. So people should be ready for that. And if you haven't already ordered your spears, order your spears. If you haven't sent your money for the spear. That's something that's really important. We've got this incredible newspaper. It's the most exciting newspaper, I'm telling you. I'm thrilled every time I open up the Burning Spear newspaper. And so, you know, we're looking, and you know, we've got an incredible editor, and we're the only revolutionary party out here with the public. Well, I could have left it at that, couldn't I? But anyway, it's a newspaper that's really important, so people should get it and should join this whole work of producing and distributing this newspaper. And also next month, I think we're planning for October 22nd. We flipped the switch, FM radio station Black Power 96. You know.
That's my birthday, Alex.
That's your birthday gift. So people should be excited by that, and I'm hoping that, if not the very same day, in addition to being able to broadcast locally, that we'll be streaming. I'd like to see us come out of that, you know, when we flip the switch, that we'll be streaming so that people can have access to us in Houston, Texas, and Stockholm, and various other places around the world. I want to thank everybody for being here. It's been a great study. We've had a great state convention, Florida State Convention here on yesterday. A lot of people came out. Great discussion. People are very excited about making this trip to Washington, D.C. I know they're lined up. I've seen evidence of the kind of work they're doing in Missouri to get in place. And I'm just hoping everybody's working as hard, because this thing that we're going to do on November 5th and 6th is going to be a turning point in the struggle about people in this country and many places around the world. So thank you again. Next Sunday, we will be here next Sunday. Next Sunday at 8 a.m. Uhuru.
Yep.